All right, let's try again. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're feeling well. And most disturbingly, when I say everyone, I mean the people who are present. It looks like half the class isn't here. And that is unfortunate for those who aren't here, because they will be totally screwed. So kudos to you for, I guess, showing up. But of course, showing up isn't a sufficient condition for acing a class, but not showing up is a great way to fail it. So if you have any friends who aren't here, who should be here, please tell them to get their act together and get their butts back in class, or they're heading for trouble. All right, now that those niceties are out of the way, let's get back to some macroeconomics. And today, I want to continue with a theme that you may have seen since we returned from our midterm, which has to do with the role of expectations in macroeconomics. We've been thinking about expectations on and off in different ways. I guess it first probably came up when we were thinking about the determinants of aggregate demand, and when we noticed that, of course, your forecast of the future could be a determinant of your behavior now. But what we're going to see, and I guess we've actually already looked at this, I just want to look at it in a slightly different way, is that expectations have a huge impact on how different shocks affect the macroeconomy, and expectations have a huge impact on how policy affects the macroeconomy. And in particular, it has a huge impact on whether or not it works. So much so that it may change how we may want to think about macroeconomic policy altogether. So to think about this, I want to refresh your memories by going back and looking at how macroeconomics was thought about several decades back. There was a particular view of how the macroeconomy worked, which informed both how people would forecast what would happen and also how people thought about monetary and fiscal policy. And to do this, I want to go back to this idea that we talked about already, which was the notion of the Phillips curve. And you'll remember the Phillips curve was, first of all, just a relationship between two key macroeconomic variables that had been observed in the data. One of those was inflation, and the other one was the unemployment rate. And you should remember that Bill Phillips took data and found that there seemed to be, if you plotted the combination of unemployment and inflation for any given year, there seemed to be a downward sloping relationship between the two. And so the Phillips curve is that link. Whose phone is going off? You will be executed. All right, so first of all, you should know what the Phillips curve is. It's this downward sloping relationship that was observed. And for a long time, and actually I should say even now among some economists, this relationship was viewed as sort of, how should I put it? Almost like a scientific fact. Like this relationship would always hold. It was almost like a law of nature that there should be this negative relationship. In fact, maybe that's the right way of thinking about it. Maybe economists for a while thought of their activity, and I guess some still do, as analogous to a natural science, let's say physics, in that they were trying to uncover not the laws of nature, but the laws of humanity, the laws of how societies work. And then, of course, they had to, having uncovered those laws, they would then have to take the second step, which was to try and understand where they came from, but this was sort of viewed as almost a law of nature. There's a, a famous economist called Amartya Sen, who, I think he's Buddhist, right? He's Hindu? Okay. Anyway, he believes in reincarnation. That's the point. And so Amartya Sen's theory of reincarnation was that a good economist is reborn as a physicist, and a bad economist is reborn as a sociologist. Anyway. So, this was sort of interpreted as a law of nature. And if you interpret this as a law of nature, that has two implications. One is, as I said, it means that you would view this as being the kinds of things that could happen. And second, it also means, or anything that we do in macroeconomics has two implications. One is about the nature of reality, and the second is about what does it tell us about policy. So if we think that this is sort of a law of physics, basically, then the implication about policy is that if you are the Fed or if you are the government choosing fiscal policy, this is basically a menu of options. Right? If this is a law of physics, then it means that the Fed, for example, let's just stick with the Fed, with its monetary policy, can choose some point on this graph. If it wants to fight unemployment, it could do so by creating inflation. And you'd have achieved your objective of having low employment, of course, at the cost of high inflation. And conversely, if you, for some reason, decided that inflation was the thing that you need to fight, then you can achieve it. You can achieve a low level of inflation, but it would be at the cost of unemployment. And so then the Fed's job, or to the extent that the government cares about macroeconomic policy, the government's job is to just pick a point on this menu. Now, fast forward to our class, we have not been discussing the Phillips curve as though it were a law of physics, or a law of society for that matter. Instead, we've been using this more abstract, and I guess as a result, more challenging theoretical framework for thinking about how the macroeconomy works, which is this. Right? We don't have this framework that we're using doesn't give you a law that says that there should be a particular relationship between inflation and unemployment, but it does give us an interpretation. We can figure out how, if this is what we observe, what must be going on. And last class, we discussed two things that are very important here. One, going back to the original theme of expectations, we discussed the difference in this framework between when a particular shock is expected and when it isn't. So rather than, well, let me see, what's the simplest way of doing this? Maybe I'm going to go all in. So last class, we discussed the idea that recalling that the short-run aggregate supply moves when wages move, first. Maybe I'll write these bullet points. short and aggregate supply moves with input costs, including wages, right? Second, wages move with inflationary expectations. Right? In other words, if you think that there's going to be a particular amount of inflation, let's say you think there's going to be 2% inflation, that means that wages would be increasing by 2%, which means that the short and aggregate supply is always moving up and up and up and up and up based on what inflation expectations are. We add to this the idea that these expectations don't come out from nowhere. They're actually reasonable. They're probably based on some combination of what we've been observing lately and our best information about, I guess, our best information about whatever it is that affects the macroeconomy. That means that this expectation should be well-founded and is based on some idea that you think the aggregate demand is going to be moving in such a manner that validates that expectation. Remember, that's what we talked about last week. Yes?
So you said you drew the AD curve moving, but you talked about why the supply curve moves. Why does the AD?
So we don't know why it's moving. The point is that the expectation of 2% inflation that leads to this supply curve moving, because the wages rise, has to be based on something. Right? And for example, it might be based on, well, it could be based on any of the factors that move the aggregate demand. It could be that, again, you expect the Fed to do something, you expect the government to increase government spending by a certain amount, you expect income abroad to increase. Whatever it is, well, I can give you a more concrete example. In general, as you may know, the Fed tries to make sure that inflation is small but positive. They try to avoid a deflationary situation because, well, there is this fear that if prices are declining, then that may lead to an economic crunch, because why would you spend now if tomorrow everything is going to be cheaper? So generally the Fed slowly but surely increases the money supply to make sure that there is some low level of inflation. And so in actual fact, that's probably the background to why you would reasonably expect the demand curve to be slowly shifting out.
So it resets the equilibrium, that's why.
Yeah. Taking that into account, our wages increase accordingly. They're set in advance because we discussed this idea of sticky wages. That means that, again, it doesn't mean that wages are stuck where they were. It means that they are being set, reset, based on our forecasts. And to the extent that our forecasts are correct, then we're just, as you put it, resetting where we are on this line. Very good. So, if this is how our theory works, how can such a theory account for an observation like this, first of all? Well, this formulation of our theory isn't saying that we will always be on the long run aggregate supply curve. What it's saying is that we will always be on the aggregate supply curve as long as our forecasts were correct. So that means that we can deviate from here if it turns out that something happened that we failed to forecast. So let's say we forecasted the demand curve would be here, but it turned out that it was somewhere over to the right. Then we're at this spot. What would we expect to observe? We would expect, actually, before I even go there, suppose we're right. Suppose the forecast is correct. Then what do we get? We get some rate of inflation, which is what? It's the rate of inflation that we expected. Let's put that here. Let's say 2% was the rate of inflation that we expected. We would get the rate of inflation that we expected, and, well, we would be at potential GDP. What does that tell us about unemployment? If you're at potential GDP, what's the rate of unemployment? The natural rate of unemployment. So we would be here. At some point here, with the natural rate of unemployment, and where this rate of inflation is what people forecast, what I'm calling expected inflation. So that's what happens if you were right. What if you were wrong? Again, what if demand, for example, moved further than you actually anticipated? Now what happens? Inflation is higher than expected, and potential GDP is higher, which means the unemployment rate is lower. So you have a higher inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate. That's exactly consistent with this pattern, right? Similarly, what if you were wrong in the opposite direction? So suppose you forecast demand to be here, and again, that might have been a very reasonable forecast, but it turned out that, one second, demand was somewhere lower. Then what would you get? You have inflation that's lower than expected, and GDP that's lower than potential, which means unemployment that's higher. So again, lower inflation, higher unemployment, it's exactly consistent with this pattern. So, to sum up, and then I'll pause. The statistical Phillips curve that was observed, which is this downward relationship, is consistent with our theory. It just means that over the period in question, the economy must have been experiencing unexpected demand shocks. Yes?
I already got it.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Any thoughts, comments? Okay. But that is not enough to support this Phillips curve as being a law of nature. We are able to explain it. It must be due to unexpected demand shocks, but that's not the same as saying that it's a fixed relationship. And what is it that undermines the idea of this being, so to speak, a law of nature? It's actually this. Remember, this whole thing is anchored, so to speak, by whatever our forecast of inflation was. What if instead of 2%, we forecast 5%? Aside from, well, actually, and what would go into that? Well, there must be some information that for some reason leads us to come up with that forecast instead. Then this would not be the relationship that we would see, right? Because if we forecast this to whatever reason, for whatever reason, be 5%, then in that situation we would have a natural rate of unemployment that corresponds to a different inflation rate, right? It would be here. And that no longer fits the statistical pattern. And this idea that the Phillips curve is, first of all, not a law of nature, and second of all, may move if people's expectations move, is something that is known among economists as the Lucas critique. After Bob Lucas III, who won the Nobel Prize for this, among other ideas. The key idea of the Lucas critique, again, is that expectations are fundamental to, in general, outcomes. And as I told you, the corollary to any statement about how something affects reality is that therefore it also affects how we should think about policy. So expectations are critical to how the business cycle works, and expectations are critical to how policy works. So to see how this Lucas critique bites, you probably need to think about exactly what was happening in the world around the time that this came up. And this is a period where we're observing this Phillips curve thing, and then we enter a period, late 60s, early 70s, when government spending is building, and so we're finding ourselves, whatever it is that people expected, let's just say people expected 2% inflation, year after year after year, we're finding ourselves here. First of all, well, okay. To some extent, it doesn't really matter why we kept seeing this, but the reason why we're seeing this was ongoing increases in government spending due to the Vietnam War, as long as a few other issues. And so economists at the time, some economists at the time, would say, okay, so we keep getting high inflation, and well, that kind of, we don't like inflation, but whatever, at least we're going to get low unemployment, so we're just picking a different point on this menu because of, well, the war needs and whatnot. And then Robert Lucas III comes along and says, no, if you keep having a situation like this year after year after year, you will no longer be on this Phillips curve, because if something keeps happening year after year after year, the people are going to figure it out. They're going to figure out that this expectation of 2% inflation doesn't make any sense. It's very clear that the government's behavior of increasing government spending year after year after year, among other things, is not going to end anytime soon, and so expecting 2% inflation doesn't make any sense. So if we observe this year after year after year, what should we expect? We should expect some higher rate of inflation. If we expect some higher rate of inflation, that means our wages are moving with inflationary expectations, not by 2%, but by more, which means this isn't going to be the supply curve. It's going to be something higher. Whoops. I don't know, let's just say 5. Right? And then we will still be on the natural rate of unemployment, but we will have a higher rate of inflation. And of course, does it mean that we're going to be at this point? This point represents what happens when expectations are fulfilled. We could still be wrong, right? There could be unanticipated demand shocks, but then that means we would, instead of having this old Phillips curve, we would have a new one that is much higher. So there is, as a result of this discussion, a new way of thinking about the Phillips curve, which I'll show you. And along with it comes a different way of thinking about policy, which I'll tell you in a sec. And what is it saying? What have we sort of derived here? Not from observing statistics from the 60s, but from thinking carefully about how the economy works. We've derived this idea that whatever it is that you expect the rate of inflation to be, that's going to correspond to the natural rate of unemployment. Where did your expected inflation come from? That's a different matter that we'll get to again. We already discussed it, but we'll come back to it in a second. But given whatever it is that your inflation forecast is, that corresponds to the natural rate of unemployment. And if it's 2%, then you're going to have a Phillips curve around that 2%. If it's 5%, you're going to have a Phillips curve around that 5%, given your expected inflation. And the way this is represented in the textbook is by saying, in the short run, the way we described the short run before was that in the short run there are sticky wages. Now we're being a little more careful, and we see that really what's sticky isn't the wages, it's your inflation forecast, which underpins them. So given a rate of expected inflation, there is a, so to speak, short run Phillips curve that corresponds to it. But in the long run, your rate of expected inflation may adapt based on all sorts of things, some of which we'll discuss soon, as in 10 minutes. And to that corresponds this notion of a long-run Phillips curve, which is this idea that, again, your rate of expected inflation corresponds to the natural rate of unemployment, whatever it is that your expected inflation is. And then, based on that, around it, in the short run, given your expected inflation, there's going to be this sort of Phillips curve relationship. And that all stems from the Lucas critique, which again is saying, I guess what the Lucas critique, this is one way of visualizing the Lucas critique. It's saying again that if something is expected, then since it's taken into account in advance, that means that it doesn't really have real effects. So if you expect low inflation, you'll be here. If you expect high inflation, you'll be here. To the extent that there are surprises, you may move off that point. But whether it's high or low ultimately depends on your expectations. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? So
So the vertical
This is all in, I think it's at the end of chapter 12. So now let's think about policy. Remember that the only way to deviate, so actually before I do this, remind ourselves that in the old days, so to speak, the statistical Phillips curve was viewed as a menu of policy options, right? So you just have to pick a point here, politically or otherwise decide which is the most desirable point on this line and choose it. Now let's think of policy with this new perspective. It is true that you could pick any point on this line, at least in the short run, right? But you can't pick it forever because, again, if you keep inflating, eventually people will figure out that's what you're doing. They'll start to expect it, and you'll end up here. So, or put it another way, the only way to deviate from the long-run Phillips curve is if you're, actually there are two things. One is, if you think that you can try and lower unemployment by inflating, you're wrong. You can only do it temporarily, and then we'll figure it out. It'll become expected, and we'll end up here with high inflation and nothing remarkable as far as unemployment is concerned, which is pointless because this point is better, right, with low inflation and reasonable unemployment. Or second, you can deviate from this point, but the only way you could do so is by doing what? By doing unexpected shocks. And unexpected shocks aren't stabilizing. So this view actually has massive implications for what you think the Fed can do and should do. So, according to this, the Fed can only influence real variables if it surprises you, which means it's not stabilizing. And second, if they persist in doing something to try and be stimulative, all they're going to end up doing is raising inflation. So this suggests that the only feasible thing the Fed could do is try and keep expected inflation reasonably low. Right? If they try and stimulate, sooner or later, what it just translates to is higher inflation. And so the best they could do is at least try and keep some expected inflation rate that's low. In other words, try and make sure that what we anticipate is 2% rather than 10 or 5 or 15 or whatever. And that's the best that the Fed can do. Try and keep expectations at a desirable level. And so this idea is, I guess one view of it is pessimistic, because when we started talking about fiscal and monetary policy, the idea was, the Fed and the government, they have this power to react to shocks as they come up. But we're seeing that the key shocks are the ones that are unexpected. And so that means that the Fed's key role is not just to react to shocks, but it's also to manage expectations, in particular to manage inflation expectations. So one pessimistic formulation of this, I guess, in the sense of there's not much else the Fed can do, is the best the Fed can do is to try to keep expected inflation low. So, if we take this view seriously, the next question, of course, is how would the Fed do that? What control does the Fed have over establishing where this point is? Like, why is expected inflation 2% and not 10%? Well, one thing the Fed can do is that since they have some control over aggregate demand, is that since our expected inflation is partly due to what we've been observing, that suggests that one way the Fed can try and, so to speak, anchor expected inflation is to just repeatedly, I guess, replicate a certain rate of inflation. Like, show that you are reliably able to deliver, in this example, this 2% that you want. And this should be reminding you of our discussion last week about the idea of rules in monetary policy, where there were several examples, but one example of rules in monetary policy was what I called inflation targeting, where the Fed announces a particular level of inflation. And you remember from the class I said, if we believe the Fed, that means that our wages would move by 2%. The Fed knows where the supply curve is, so it can do whatever it can to, like, I don't know, grow the money supply by 2% or whatever it is to try and hit that point. Pardon me? Yeah. Rules in monetary policy is something that we discussed last week. We discussed several examples. One of them, I guess the main one is this one, the idea of the inflation target, which is, well, which you can see now why that might be a good idea. You're making sure that the short-run Phillips curve is somewhere relatively desirable because you don't want people to expect a high rate of inflation because, as we discussed, inflation wastes resources. And then, of course, you have to try and so to speak, realize the expectation because output gaps are based on mismatches between expectations, largely due to mismatches between expectations and reality. But by, again, I use this word, anchoring expectations somewhere, it makes the Fed's job a lot easier because, again, it makes it easier for them to hit this point. And second, it also makes sure this point is somewhere with a fairly low inflation rate. So all that was predicated on the idea of us believing the Fed. Then that suggests that a key asset of the Fed, critical for making sure that it can deliver good macroeconomic outcomes, is exactly that. Do we believe the Fed? Our trust in the Fed, or put another way, the Fed's credibility, is therefore going to be key in the Fed being able to deliver good outcomes. If we trust the Fed and the Fed keeps saying we're going to deliver 2% inflation, then we're more likely to be here. If we don't trust the Fed says, I'm going to give you 2% inflation, that's what economists call cheap talk. It's meaningless if we don't trust them. And then we would expect something else. How can the Fed gain credibility? Well, it could gain credibility, as I was discussing, by repeatedly delivering on its promises. I discussed with you before this period at the end of the 70s inflation when Paul Volcker was the chairperson of the Fed. Inflation was 14, 15%, which of course is the opposite of credibility. So we're somewhere way up here with some short-run Phillips curve at some insanely high inflation rate. And what did he do? He said, I'm going to deliver 2% inflation or some low level of inflation regardless of the cost. So this is, let's say, 1980, 1981. Expected inflation is super high. Paul Volcker says, I got to get expected inflation down. How do I do it? I deliver low inflation regardless of the cost. So he goes to a point somewhere here, right? Delivering low inflation and extremely high unemployment for a short period of time. What does that do? It means that the public sees, oh my gosh, this Volcker guy is hardcore. He's going to deliver low inflation regardless of the cost. We believe him. And so, of course, after that, the Fed gains credibility as an inflation fighter. Expected inflation drops, and now we're here. How does the Fed lose credibility? We kind of already looked at that. Right? How does the Fed lose credibility? The Fed loses credibility if we observe high inflation for a while. Then either we would lose our confidence in the Fed's seriousness as an inflation fighter, or we would lose our trust in the Fed's ability to control inflation. And how might that happen? Again, one, repeated inflationary gaps. Right? After repeated inflationary gaps, you would like in the 60s and early 70s, you would reasonably conclude that this is going to continue. Or, as we discussed before, repeated supply shocks. Negative supply shocks also increase inflation, and if you are unlucky enough to get lots of supply shocks year after year, which we are currently in the middle of enjoying, then of course that might also throw off your expected inflation, and you would have a short-run supply curve that's somewhere higher. The Fed would have lost credibility, and the only way for the Fed to get it back, as discussed, is painful. So among macroeconomists, a lot of the debate about how monetary policy should or shouldn't be conducted revolves around how can monetary policy be done in a credible fashion? How do you maintain your credibility, especially in difficult times like when there are supply shocks around? Okay, any questions, thoughts, comments? So let's see how we're doing for time. We have about half an hour. So finally, I guess the next logical thing to do is to discuss whether there are any known determinants of credibility. Is there anything that central banks can do other than, I guess, being hardcore when push comes to shove, to try and underline or certify their credibility? Or conversely, I guess, are there any things that undermine the credibility of central banks as inflation fighters? And to think about that, remember that when you've lost credibility, the only way to establish it is what? So once you're up here, once you've lost credibility and expected inflation is high, how do you gain your credibility back and get this back down? Remember, I'll just draw what I had here again. So you're here, somewhere on this upper Phillips curve because expected inflation has gone out of control. You want to get back down here. The only way you can do that is by delivering low inflation for a while until people realize you're serious and adapt their expectations accordingly. And what does this do? Aside from lowering inflation, it creates a recession for the time that it takes for people to figure out that you mean business. So the price of credibility is, or I guess the source of credibility is a willingness to cause economic damage as measured by unemployment and low output as a price of regaining control of expected inflation. So what could underline credibility, or what could actually, so I guess what that suggests is that your credibility as an inflation fighter hinges on your ability and willingness to cause recessions if necessary. Now, what might undermine your ability to cause such damage, even though you may think it's necessary? Presumably, your sensitivity or exposure, I guess, to the people who are being damaged. Right? If you're going to do this to try and lower expected inflation, you're going to hurt a lot of people. A lot of people are going to be unemployed for a while. A lot of people will have low incomes. And if they are able to pressure you, you're less likely to do it. So what this is suggesting is the idea that a key determinant of central bank credibility is, broadly speaking, their independence. What do I mean by this? So the way this country is set up, there are certain government institutions that are supposed to be highly responsive to the people, like Congress, right? You vote for people to go there and represent you. If they do a good job representing you, you vote them back in. If they don't do a good job representing you, you kick them out and put someone else in instead. So there is this governmental body that makes government decisions about policy that is responsive to you. Do you think if Congress had the power to do it, they would do this? Would your representatives in Congress take acts that would dramatically increase unemployment, even if the objective, of course, is to get inflation under control? Seems unlikely. What about the Fed? Do you vote for who's on the Fed? Who makes decisions at the Fed? Only very indirectly. How is the leader of the Fed chosen? Yeah? The president nominates the leader. Exactly. It's actually multi-layered process, right? The president nominates the chairperson of the Fed, and this person has to be confirmed by the Senate. So there's some, obviously, those are all elected representatives, and so there's some responsiveness to the people there. But the chairperson of the Fed has a term of how many years? 7, which doesn't link up with the 4-year presidential term. And then you have the senators changing as well. So very often the president is, as right now actually, the president of the country, which is the head of the executive, is dealing with the chairperson of the Fed who was nominated and confirmed by a previous government. The current, like Jerome Powell, the current chair of the Fed, was nominated and confirmed during Trump's presidency, but he's still here with Biden. So, long story short, the Fed is independent, at least much more independent from political pressures than the rest of the government. This suggests that, in general, the independence of the central bank might be a key determinant of whether or not it is credible. If instead, imagine that all, the opposite extreme, imagine that all monetary policy decisions have to be voted on by Congress, then you'll never get a point like this, right? Or it's much less likely, I guess. So, which is a little, I mean, there's a tension there, right? Presumably you want something as powerful as the Fed to be somehow sensitive to to the constituents' views. On the other hand, this is suggesting that too much sensitivity to constituents' views might actually undermine the Fed's ability to do its job. In particular, to deliver stable low inflation. So there is a literature on this, and I'm going to show you some data on this now. You may think, Professor Samaniego, I understand the logic of independence, that the Fed is less likely to be able to fight inflation to the extent that it's closer to the voters, and we're calling this distance from political pressure independence. But if we want to look at data on this, how would we measure it? So, given this, given the potential importance of central bank independence, that means that some considerable effort was devoted to measuring this by macroeconomists, and they've measured it by looking at things like what I just described. Does the Congress vote on monetary policy, or does the Fed make it on its own? Is the chairperson of the Fed an elected person, or are they nominated, or are they by the government or not? And so on. In some countries, for example, the Fed and the Treasury are the same. That's like the opposite of independence. Okay? So I'm going to show you some data on central bank independence in a second. Before I do that, I'm going to tell you something about the set of countries that we're going to look at. So you might imagine that if you want to look at central bank independence, and we're going to get a clean idea of how central bank independence is related to macroeconomic outcomes, we probably want to focus on, broadly speaking, stable countries. So as opposed to what? As opposed to, for example, I've told you about when I was growing up in Peru and we experienced 8,000% inflation in 1 year and it was a nightmare. And so, but you might think, well, that probably doesn't have to do with central bank independence, right? There's a whole bunch of other things going on there that could mess things up. So we're going to focus only on the wealthiest countries in the world. And then that creates a new problem because the wealthiest countries in the world, many of them actually share a currency. In other words, they have the same central bank. So we're going to go back in time to before the euro was adopted. So we're going to be looking at data from before the euro was adopted, focusing on the wealthier countries in the world. All right. So here is a figure. And these are data averaged, I think, over the 70s and 80s and early 90s. So again, before the euro was adopted. And this is on the x-axis, an index of central bank independence measured roughly as I described. And on the y-axis, we have average inflation over those decades. Some countries here don't share currencies now, but you have France, Belgium, Netherlands, they all share a currency now. So that's why I want to go back in time. And what do you see? You see, indeed, that countries with more independent central banks indeed seem to be able to deliver lower average inflation. And again, that's consistent with what we were discussing. The idea that if a central bank is not independent from the rest of the government, it may be under pressure to, well, it may not have credibility as an inflation fighter. There are lots of reasons why, I guess, having a Fed that's closer to the government might mean you are under pressure not to fight inflation. Here's another one. Imagine that we live in a place where government officials have some control over monetary policy. What do you think those government officials are going to do in the months leading up to an election? Well, what makes you more likely to be elected, re-elected, if you're a government official? The economy doing well or the economy doing badly? Government officials are more likely to be booted out of office if the economy isn't doing great. Now give those government officials control of the Fed. What are they going to do just before an election? If they can. They're going to lower interest rates to try and boost the economy just before the election and say, look what a great job I'm doing. Re-elect me. And so, of course, in a country such as, let's say, Switzerland, where the central bank is independent, they can't do that. In a country such as, well, Spain back in the 80s, where the central bank was not independent, there was some ability to do that, to put pressure on the Spanish central bank to inflate just before elections. So that's yet another reason why this might happen. Now, consider, however, that whether your central bank is independent is not a mystery. You know where you live. You know if your central bank is kind of independent or not. Or alternatively, even if you don't know that, you still get to observe actual inflation rates and update your expectations accordingly, right? So what I'm saying is, we should get higher average inflation in places where independence is low, and lower inflation where independence is high. But is this higher inflation a surprise? No. At least not for long. You'll sooner or later figure it out. In other words, we have these negative outcomes in terms of average inflation if your central bank is not independent. But if all our theory is right, and the Phillips curve is not a law of nature, but rather expectations are what really matters for what we observe, then central bank independence should not be related to real variables. It should not be, in particular, it should not be related to unemployment. It should not be related to economic growth. It should not be related to, well, real variables. So let's check that. Okay. Here is central bank independence again on the x-axis, and average GDP growth over the same period. Is there any relationship here? No, it's just a blob with Japan up top for some reason. So no link between independence and economic growth. What about unemployment? There we go. There is average unemployment. Is there any link between average unemployment and central bank independence? No, it's a blob. Why is it shaking? That's the projector that's shaking. Is there an earthquake? Another of the things I don't miss about being in Peru. So, no, there's no clear link between central bank independence and unemployment. There is variation in unemployment, and since this is over several decades, that tells you that the natural rate of unemployment for some reason could vary from place to place. That's interesting. But it's unrelated to central bank independence. So again, this Phillips curve that we saw at the beginning is not a law of nature. And inflation is something that central banks can control over long periods of time, but it has to do with their credibility, not with their, and of which independence is a factor, not with what they're doing with their stabilization policy otherwise. So I guess to try and sum this all up, the view of monetary policy that sort of comes out of thinking about expectations carefully is that, first of all, the Phillips curve is not a menu of options. Second, the central bank's short-run ability to stabilize the economy, might be there, but in the long run, their ability to deliver a sort of stable, low inflation environment depends on some sort of deeper things like their independence from political influence. There seems to be data to support that, and there seems to be no upside to this lack of independence, in the sense that low independent central banks give you high inflation, and it's not like they're giving you low unemployment as a side benefit. They're not giving you really anything. There is one thing, however, that I actually cobbled together, so this is not from the paper, which is I didn't look at GDP growth over the period. I showed you that figure already, but what I did was I collected data on the average level of GDP per capita over that period in these places. And I got this. Is there a link here? There is. The more independent central banks tend to be in countries where GDP per capita is higher. Does that mean that that low independence causes low GDP? It's not enough to conclude that, right? But it does. My preferred conclusion would be that countries with low independence central banks are countries with messed up institutions in general. But I could be wrong. Maybe it is causal. Maybe having a crappy central bank. Because as discussed, having persistently high inflation erodes GDP. There are good reasons why we might reach that conclusion. So maybe this is causal. Not sure. Something to write your senior thesis about if you're an econ major. Right. Any questions or comments, thoughts? All right. In that case, time for today's exit quiz. Question 1. The Phillips curve is a statistical link between what? Inflation and unemployment, of course. Next. At first, the Phillips curve was viewed as what? A menu of policy options. Next.
No!
What does the Lucas critique say about the Phillips curve? And that is a photo of Bill Phillips, one of the few famous New Zealanders. Next. What should we expect before elections if the central bank isn't independent? That's a picture of the current chairperson of the Fed, Jerome Powell. Is he independent? They would lower interest rates. Independence and inflation are what? Positively related? Negatively related? What are they? Of course, they are negatively related. Based on the data we just saw, independence and economic growth are related in what fashion? The answer is that they are not related. Question for you. Do you think the Fed is independent? No correct answer to this one, of course. Just gauging your views. And it seems you think it is. All right. Last question. Based on the data we saw in class, independence is related to a high level of GDP per person. Yes or no? Correct. All right, let's see how we did. If you're the winner, feel free to come up. I have a little something for you. Essa is third, good job. Second is Harrison. I'm guessing you did that on purpose. And first is Daniel. All right, Daniel, good job. Have a little something for you. Everyone else, nice to see you. Look forward to seeing you in office hours or in class on Wednesday. Take care.